Is Wolverine's adamantium skeleton actually holding him back from his full potential? What sort of massive advantages does Wolverine get when he doesn't have the adamantium coating on his skeleton? Wolverine's iconic adamantium claws have been a staple of the character for decades, ever since his very inception. But as we would later come to find out, these claws are actually part of his mutation, which granted him 6 extra bones that could protrude from his knuckles at will. The adamantium itself was only a result of the Weapon X procedure, which lined his skeleton in the nigh indestructible alloy, rendering Wolverine all but unkillable. So then, what did Logan actually have to sacrifice in favor of this adamantium upgrade, or a seeming upgrade? Well, today, let's talk about the disadvantages of Logan's physiology before and after the Weapon X procedure, as we come to find out that Logan may actually be more dangerous without his adamantium. On the surface, it seems like the Weapon X operation would have been a complete set of benefits. After all, Logan's skeleton was now on the brink of being unbreakable. This, however, came with a few major drawbacks, not the least of which was sacrificing his agility and dexterity in favor of more durability. Wolverine is extremely athletic, and this much is well known about the character. But what if we were to tell you that there was a night and day difference between his agility before and after the adamantium? Wolverine's strength is beyond that of a normal individual, and is even beyond that of most enhanced human characters. But we can compare him on a global scale of what Earth has to offer. He's actually quite average by superhuman standards. Logan has to use a considerable amount of his strength just to keep himself upright, because of the adamantium skeleton, and the fact that it has increased his weight by hundreds of pounds, around 300 pounds accurately, which is all packed into a 5'3" frame. Of course, if we're going from comics. Wolverine is certainly agile with this skeleton, but he had to relearn how to become more acrobatic after the operation was concluded. It's also come pre-packaged with some immediate weaknesses, one of which is Wolverine's ability to swim. Wolverine has stated before that he deliberately avoids water whenever he can, and for good reason. If Wolverine was ever incapacitated and thrown into water, the skeleton would cause him to immediately sink straight to the bottom, where he would subsequently drown. But the only problem is that Wolverine can't drown permanently. Instead, what would happen is he would sink like an adamantium-filled stone, and then drown and come back to life over and over again. Logan's healing factor would allow him to recover from drowning, but since he can't take in any oxygen, he would never be able to muster the strength necessary to swim back to the surface. If the water was deep enough, he would drown back into consciousness before ever reaching the surface. And through all of this, he would never get a gasp of air. This would quite honestly be a fate worse than death, as Wolverine would be trapped in an eternal cycle of drowning and healing without ever being able to catch his breath. A major weakness. Wolverine is able to swim, but he doesn't often enjoy it because of the fact that he needs to focus so much of his strength on keeping himself afloat. This isn't to say that Wolverine is automatically doomed to die whenever he interacts with water, just that the odds are significantly stacked against him in this domain, and anyone who could take advantage of this weakness would have a much easier time with Wolverine than other enemies. This is all before we get into one of his most obvious and infamous weaknesses, which at its core is an extremely unfortunate coincidence. Wolverine is eternally loyal to the X-Men, even if he puts on the rugged loner persona in order to throw people off the scent. What this means, though, is that he is often drawn into some of the X-Men's most formidable battles against some of their most dangerous enemies, one of whom who has built his entire identity on his ability to control metal. The fact that Magneto is one of the X-Men's most common villains is a cosmic joke to Wolverine, who continually has to fight the master of magnetism with a skeleton which can be flung around by a flick of Magneto's wrist. This is an entirely circumstantial weakness, but it's still an extremely unfortunate one. It is, however, not the last of the sacrifices that Wolverine has had to make when undergoing the Weapon X procedure, even if he wasn't fully aware of it at the time. As he would come to find out later, though, is that his healing factor is much more effective without the adamantium and the bonding to his bones, and there are a few reasons why this is true. The first is, we know that bone marrow produces new blood cells, and that red blood cells primarily are responsible for patching minor wounds. For normal people, this is what essentially is scabbing, but for Wolverine, his blood flow quite literally rebuilds entire limbs as he needs them. Since Wolverine's blood has a more difficult time circulating with the skeleton, though, his healing factor can sometimes work a bit more slowly than it would and it was capable of once. But there's an even bigger reason at play. The only reason that Wolverine was able to survive the procedure in the first place was because of this very same healing factor. Otherwise, the adamantium would have poisoned any other test subject and eventually would have killed them. Since Wolverine's healing factor is able to outpace the adamantium poisoning though, he can live with an adamantium skeleton and minimal adverse side effects, at least at first. As Logan gets older though, we come to learn that the skeleton has been poisoning him this entire time, and that his healing factor was getting weaker and weaker with his old age. Wolverine can in fact die of old age. This is the most prevalent in the Logan movie, and was originally adapted from the Old Man Logan comic story. And it is here where it is confirmed that the healing factor and the adamantium have been at war for decades. For most of his life afterwards, Logan's healing factor was winning this fight handily, but that also meant that it had to split focus between healing the adverse effects of adamantium, but also catching up with whatever other injuries Wolverine had at any given time. In some cases, it's shown that his healing factor works much faster and more effectively when his skeleton is not laced with adamantium, though his healing factor is already so strong that it hardly makes a difference most of the time. We even got to see a look at what Wolverine could have been when he had the adamantium ripped off of his bones by Magneto. In this particular story, X-Men number 25, Wolverine had to be telekinetically held together by Jean Grey until his healing factor could get him back on track. When he did, however, he found that his skeleton was also holding back some of his more bestial instincts and his mutation, and this resulted in a much more violent and aggressive version of Wolverine. After some further degradation though, including a failed attempt to rebond the adamantium to his skeleton, Wolverine went completely feral and became an almost mindless animal with virtually none of the original Wolverine personality left. He was truly a dangerous animal. This is how we ended up with the famous noseless Wolverine, which has gone down in history as something of a joke among fans. This does go to show that the skeleton is hampering some of the more extreme parts of Logan's mutation though, and in some cases, some of the more dangerous parts. There were of course other advantages that he got as well, including first off, a complete immunity to stress fractures. Before the procedure, the limits of Wolverine's strength were defined by two factors. Can his muscles handle the weight? And then, can his bones handle the weight? If his bones couldn't hold up whatever it was he was trying to achieve, then this would result in stress fractures, and even broken bones if he was pushed too far. These bones would obviously heal, but it was still a hindrance that took time. But with the skeleton, his strength is now only defined by the limits of his muscular system. If his muscles can lift something, then Wolverine can achieve it without other variables in play. This also momentarily increased his durability, especially when he's fighting heavy hitters in the superhero community. If he has broken bones in battle, he'd have to wait for them to heal before he could continue fighting again, assuming that his bones healed correctly, which is another matter entirely. This has made it much easier to temporarily take Wolverine out of a fight while his skeleton has to mend itself. But now, this isn't really an issue. He can take much more punishment now than he previously was able to, and perhaps a good counterpart that we can look to for this is Deadpool, who has a healing factor that is on par with Wolverine's, if not better. The two are comparable as far as the caliber of healing powers, but it's much easier to take Deadpool out of the game by cutting off his limbs and blowing him into pieces or tearing him apart. This won't kill Wade, but it will end the fight until further notice, and pre-Weapon X Wolverine wasn't much better off than we see from Wade. He can have his limbs cut off in just the very same way as Deadpool, and he'd have to wait for them to regrow naturally from the splintered bones instead of just rebuilding the muscle and skin tissue around the adamantium bone, which was left intact, giving a huge plus to the adamantium. This means that in terms of healing factors, the two are of the same caliber, but Wolverine's often has less legwork to do since his skeleton stopped him from getting more seriously injured. What's interesting about this discussion though, is that the physical advantages and disadvantages of having the skeleton versus not are not a one-to-one comparison. There are different things that he can do more easily with one condition over the other, but saying he's outright more powerful in one state or another is up for debate, despite of course what the title says. So then, we want to hear from you. Are the sacrifices of Logan's agility, swimming ability, and the slowing of his healing factor worth the advantages that come with having an adamantium skeleton? Please let us know your thoughts on this down below, and the idea that Logan not having adamantium did actually have some advantages as well, although in the end, he was much more dangerous. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching. Hulk smash that subscribe button for more Marvel lore, and I hope you're having a great day.